It is a delight to be here tonight. I don't know many of you because we moved here recently, but we have been very welcomed at our new parish of Resurrection, and we hope to meet all of you in the upcoming future. I would like to thank Father Mattson and Brian Fink for inviting me here tonight, and also my good husband, Jeff. He is always willing to help me and lend a hand in whatever project I bring home. It is a very good thing that in the field of humanities, for the most part, lectures are given by the speaker reading their own papers. Yet doesn't it seem ironic that in a field where words and imagination abound, we would be limited by reading our papers? Did you know that this is not the case at all in scientific conferences? My husband is a scientist. I have attended scientific conferences. When they lecture, it is all about numbers, exact measurements, quantities, ratios, numeric data. For this arts and humanities lover, numbers, as marvelous as they may be, they do not tell stories. And scientists, they do not read their papers. They present them using visual aids. Their stories are their, quote, arguments, where the numbers in tables and very neat graphs provide evidence to persuade the audience. Words for them seem to be mere accessories. Words seem to be there just to weave their numbers into some comprehensive form. In the field of arts and humanities, however, it is a very dangerous thing to let oneself go off script. An unscripted lecture would always risk going on and on into countless tangents and digressions. So the fact that I'm reading this tonight is safety for me and very likely a relief for you. In heaven, it is my wish that numbers will be kept to a necessary minimum, while imagination will go on and on ad infinitum around the dinner table, alongside good friends, great conversation, vintage wine, and delicious food. It is to the dinner table that I want to bring you right now to begin tonight's wonderful topic of good books. How to identify them, how to better read them, the reasons we delight so much in them. What better subject to spend a Saturday evening thinking about? As a wife and mother of 7 children for many years, the dinner table, the sacred space where we gather every day, has served for me also as the learning table, the imagination table, the table of stories, stories told and listened to. During a day of preparing a careful meal for family and guests, it is exactly the expectation of that dinner table conversation that keeps me humming and singing as I peel, wash, saute, and roast in the kitchen. I love to cook. And so very often are these dinner conversations about good books. Few occasions serve as better environment for the discussion of ideas, the telling of stories, the long conversations about books as the dinner table. Once the prayer and the blessing have been said, and guests and hosts alike are enjoying the food, an invariable conversation opener comes up. So, I'm reading this book. People begin recounting passages. They're telling relevant stories. Comparisons are made. Remembrances brought up from books they've read before. A dinner guest may suddenly lift the glass of port wine and exclaim, "That's exactly it." And another one will wonder, "I never thought about that passage that way." While another may ponder, "This is fascinating." To us at home, this is a bit of heaven, a foretaste of heaven. And I truly hope that this scenario is very familiar to you. There is one aspect that unites this table conversations with similar table conversations all around the planet. The books discussed are almost invariably good books, as vague or ambiguous the term good books may be. So we will discuss that in a little bit. I believe there is a general agreement about what a good book is. Books that spring conversations are going to be worthy books of some sort. Here I must include one exception that has happened to us. Maybe someone is relating the sorrow of a child having to read an inferior book for school. And that's always a sorrowful part. But for the most part, we all want to discuss excellent books. I don't mean we'll be discussing Plato's dialogues and Sophocles' strategies at every dinner, or even Don Quixote or Shakespeare. There are all kinds of good books to be discussed. We may even bring up some mundane books. I bring up a good murder mystery anytime. I love Agatha Christie. My husband loves the Jeeves and Wooster series. They're hilarious, sarcastic, and very carefully crafted stories by Wodehouse, which, by the way, always turn out to be extremely moral. A serious nonfiction book may come up as well, especially the ones with interesting new research on beloved topics of study. Yet one thing is for sure, we'll not be discussing the cheap paperbacks with the embarrassing front cover illustrations that populate every public library. And we will seldom mention self-help books or huge bestsellers. There is definitely an understood agreement that there is such a thing as a good book, and the ones in that class are worth reading and worth discussing. For us here tonight at Resurrection Parish, the idea of a good book may be very easily grasped, as opposed to the secular world out there in which we must live. Here, we know the good, what the good is, the good with capital G. Social media would show us in less than 30 seconds that the world out there has lost the grasp on the concept of an objective good. But here, we know there is a good with capital G, the one whose beauty itself, the one whose love itself. We know who we are. We know where we're going. We know the purpose of our life. How simple, how satisfying is this knowledge to guide all of our days and actions. How fortunate we are to have been given this grace, our lives directed by our ultimate purpose. Sinners that we all are. We have so much to help us on this journey. The sacraments and the guidance of our parish priest and the church, not least among them. So simply put, a good book is the one that will help us to get to our final destination, the divine destination each one of us is created for. A good book will teach us lessons of virtue and bring us to tears with true sorrow and heartfelt victories over evil. A good book can entertain immensely, joy being God-given and a gift for us. However, this entertainment will be life-affirming and not immersed in the muck of debauchery or in gratuitous graphic descriptions of evil. The joy of reading a good book stems from this longing that we all have, and we carry it in our hearts, given to us by our Creator to guide us in this vale of tears. The same deep longing that brings us to tears when we are faced with great beauty, an unexpected, gorgeous sunset stretched out in front of us, a moving painting that takes our breath away when we enter a new room in the art museum, the tears we shed when we witness an act of pure love, that longing that says, I am made for this, I want more of this. For the sincere Christian, we know what this desire is. We know we have been made for it. We're willing to live this life in preparation for it, even if trampled by the weight of this world, and worse yet, by the weight of our own sins. So now we can look a bit further into this concept of a good book. We will explore the idea of great books and then on to mentioning and recommending a few authors, favorites of mine. I need to start with a personal anecdote. My husband and I like to say that when we met and we were married, so did our books. They have been multiplying ever since. Like us, once they were a very young collection, aspiring to greater heights, idealistic and filled with promise. Like us, through the years, they gained depth, they gained experience, and our collection of paper friends expanded sideways in variety and in depth. Our collection of books about the lives of the saints, for example, became ever expanding, and the authors we encountered together gained prominent place. We shall never forget reading Saint Teresa of the Cross for the first time together and promising to name our next daughter after this intellectual and courageous woman, Saint Teresa Benedicta. Our youngest child is Teresa Benedicta. As the children came, the classic stories we read as children were reintroduced and explored as a family. Book lovers we were when we were this new young married couple, one babe in arms and another one in utero. We were invited, and we had an invitation to join a book group. This group was made of fellow graduates of my husband's alma mater, which happens to be the Pioneer Great Book Scholars Program in the United States. We were still poor graduate students, and we were sort of struck as we were hosted in a beautiful home and entertained with very good wine, fine cheese, cakes, amidst professionals in the law and medical fields, among others. The book in question for that evening was a magnificent classic, Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. I couldn't wait to discuss that brilliant and unforgettable psychological novel about how contemplating and committing a crime wreaks havoc in the soul. What comes into mind when you're planning a murder? What leads a person to make that decision? How does the soul react to such an action? How does one find a way out of its devastating aftermath? There were so many questions I was eager to see explored that evening. Here we were among educated readers who are all owners of much larger life experience than we were. Undoubtedly, we were in for a very rich discussion. The discussion started. Intelligent observations, quotes lifted directly from the book, passages read of this great classic of Russian literature. Soon enough, however, I am sad to report, things went sour. The topics began flowing from the book to small, petty, personal opinions, unclear digressions. They brought up details, twisted and turned them this way and that way, and even attempted to insert them back into the story. But I knew they had the wrong end up. I tried to intercept, save the discussion, desperately. But who was I, nursing a baby, this novice, this know-nothing? Believe me, and my husband will nod here, I can be very loud and demanding. But that evening, my attempts were little more than feeble. On the way home, my husband navigated the nighttime traffic of the big city, and I was flabbergasted. I was almost shouting, here's Dostoevsky writing this amazing book of how Christian love redeems not only the guilty conscience, but also how it affects everything around it. Think of Sonia, such a complex character, a redeemer, and a redeemed one herself. A book about forgiveness, salvation, that brings the reader gleaming from the very darkest opening. Crime and Punishment will survive the millennia for being a fantastic, innovative account of the bright light of love, conquering darkness inside the human mind. And what were they discussing? Their petty distortions with examples from their mundane lives. What a waste of an evening. What's the good of their dressed up looks, the heels, the ties, the blazers, if they spent the whole evening missing the point? My poor husband. There he was, the quiet scientist, even-tempered guy, just listening, driving us home, loving his wife and his babies every minute of the way. Don't we love how God make marriages so complementary? I think that night Outraged at seeing crime and punishment turned upside down, I made a decision for life: to love and promote good reading, to read to our kids, to participate, to lead, and even start book groups, writing about books, writing book reviews. They were all the positive results of that evening, and I thank God for that. He, the author of all that is good. The book group we attended that night was made of college graduates of the same institution. It is also my husband's alma mater, St. John's College in Maryland. That small liberal arts college was the first to completely adopt the so-called Great Books program as their sole curriculum, and it became very well known for that. Many of their graduates are active in the fields of journalism, broadcast media, medicine, law, and education. Their program is secular, yet it is able to bring a student to the ultimate end of one's sincere quest for truth. My husband is not their only graduate who has come into the church. We have a good priest friend who speaks with fond memories of the discoveries he made during the years in that same college, which led him to the church and eventually to the seminary and to holy priesthood. Unfortunately, it is more common for a graduate from such a program to be armed with intellectual arrogance and a very bad habit of analyzing everything as if answers or truth do not matter at all. Thankfully, there are excellent Catholic Great Books programs, colleges programs out there, and the reading list is immersed in faithful theology, and where the academic life is bathed in gorgeous, centuries-old liturgy. We are delighted to say that we have a daughter now in one such college, and she loves every day there. Back when my husband was in college, Jeff had the opportunity to attend a lecture given by the philosopher, educator, and author Mortimer Adler. Adler was one of the founders of the Great Books movement. He was one with a number of academics at the University of Chicago who were concerned about how to improve the education system in the United States. They thought there was a need to return to the Western liberal arts tradition as a turn away from the over-specialized progressive approach to education that was advocated in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Colleges that incorporated the Great Books curriculum used classic works as their primary texts, and for the most part, Socratic-style roundtable seminars instead of lectures by professors. For those of you not familiar with this approach, the teacher in the Socratic-style classroom guides the students' discussion on the material read by asking the opening question, gently prodding along the subsequent discussion by the students. Similar programs are adopted as an option in some larger universities. Case in point, the program of liberal studies at University of Notre Dame and the Ignatius Institute at University of San Francisco. Not only larger, well-known universities, but also smaller ones took the same approach within certain departments. In the small city of Marshall in southwestern Minnesota, the state university used to have, and I quote, an honors program that was based off St. John's College in Maryland, where the students read many of the great books. This quote is from a good friend of ours, a graduate of that same honors program. He told us this when we were meeting in his office one day. He pointed to the many volumes that look so familiar of great books on his shelves. Those were partly responsible for his priestly vocation, he told us, a big smile on his face. He became a very good friend, and he celebrated the nuptial masses of 2 of our children. As smaller Great Books program inside universities go, there is the very interesting history of the short-lived Integrated Humanities program at the University of Kansas, led by Professors Senior, Quinn, and Netlick from 1970 to 1984. There, students enrolled by the hundreds, they read the great books, they went stargazing, they learned and sang songs by the campfire, they learned to ballroom dance, and did many other such quote-unquote classical activities. They traveled to Europe to visit ancient Benedictine monasteries. They rediscovered the wonder of life, the excitement of searching for truth, and numerous of the students converted to the Catholic faith. Some of the graduates of that program became educators, professors, priests. One founded a college. At least one is a bishop today. Interestingly, one alumnus became a lifelong Latin educator, and he is the author of the Latin program that I use here at Resurrection School. Quite a few of them entered the monastic life in France, and in 1999, some of these same University of Kansas students, now fully professed monks, arrived back at the United States to start a new Benedictine foundation. If you're ever planning on a trip to Northeast Oklahoma, call ahead the Abbey of Clear Creek and enjoy their beautiful Benedictine hospitality in their guest house. From their humble beginnings, in less than 20 years, they now have grown to 50 monks. Their website, clearcreekmonks.org, tells their story with gorgeous pictures of the buildings, landscape, and their working farm. And there you can read the details about how that short-lived integrated humanities program at the University of Kansas and the great books they read were the seed for it all. Talk about how fruitful we can be when we say fiat to God's plans. So you may ask, what does a great books education look like? At St. John's College, they start with the Greeks as freshmen: Homer, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Herodotus, Thucydides, Plato, Aristotle. Then as sophomores, they go on to the Romans: Virgil, Tacitus, Plutarch, Livy. Many books of the Bible: medieval philosophy, medieval literature, St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Anselm, Dante. And the Renaissance: Machiavelli, Bacon, Shakespeare, and so on. You get the picture. They read and discuss philosophy, literature, history, some theology, and plenty of math and science, all from primary sources, though usually in English. No textbooks and not one classroom lecture. Our daughter Maria is a sophomore at Thomas Aquinas College in California, which is the Catholic analog to St. John's. In her blog, she wrote about her favorite readings during freshman year. I cannot think here of a better window for us to glimpse at what it is to be educated with the great books. She starts with the Bible, and I quote, "For freshman theology, we read the entire Bible throughout the year. I enjoyed it as much as I expected to, maybe even more, but I loved certain books of the Bible far more than I thought I would. Most of the books of the prophets were great, filled with solemn pronouncements and the various anecdotes so familiar to us. The book of Ezekiel was a whole different experience. It felt a lot more like reading Revelation than the other prophetic books, with all of Ezekiel's strange and disturbing visions. Our class discussions on Ezekiel were out of this world. We focused especially on chapter 16, which is a rebuke of Israel for her faithlessness in view of all that God has done for her. The imagery of a virgin bride turned harlot, which occurs in countless places throughout the Old Testament, here holds a unique bitterness, a tone reminiscent of a jilted lover. The author details how God brought up Israel to be a beautiful bride, adorned her with finery, but she turned away from him and sowed her beauty in sordid places. The comparisons of Israel's sins with those of notorious cities such as Sodom and Gomorrah is harsh to the point of damning. Despite all this railing against Israel's harlotry, Ezekiel 16 ends with an affirmation of God's continuing fidelity and mercy. Nothing that Israel can do, not even the most abominable of sins, can stop God from loving her as his own. And he is willing to reestablish his covenant with her again and again, as many times as she repents and turns back to him. There is no vindictiveness in this jilted lover, only deep and unutterable mercy." End quote. Next, she mentions loving to read Aristotle's posterior analytics because she was convinced that he explains things the way her brain works. And to her, it all made sense. She loved learning logic, by reading Aristotle and finishes her comments on that book by saying, quote, "All this experience of logic really makes me aware of people's arguments and what that makes them valid or invalid," end quote. A third book she mentions is Gregor Mendel's account of his experiments in genetics. Quote, "Natural science was definitely the hardest class for me in freshman year. Despite it being the most intense and lively class from my already wild and combative classmates, I didn't find the subject material very engaging at all. That is, until we read Mendel. Reading his account of his experiments on thousands of pea plants was fascinating. His simple method of observing and opening every single pea pod to record its characteristics yielded some remarkable results. It was amazing how when he had enough samples, tens of thousands of them, the numbers he counted by observation matched up almost perfectly with the numbers he predicted by his probability ratios. Mendel's discoveries are still relevant today, as that quiet little botanist monk is now known as the father of genetics. Reading Mendel's report, I was so enthusiastic about his successful experiments that I explained it to several of my friends on campus, including my roommate Emily, whose section had the misfortune of skipping the Mendel reading due to schedule constraints. I had never experienced such excitement about natural science before," end quote. The fourth book she mentions was the Greek historian Thucydides. Quote, "The Peloponnesian Wars was one of the two things we read in seminar that effectively killed almost all freshman enthusiasm. Our 3 weeks spending on Thucydides involved 150 to 200-page readings of dry historical accounts every week, which turned even finishing the seminar readings into a rare occurrence, let alone liking them. To be honest, I'm not really sure why I liked Thucydides so much. The military aspect of his history, it was about a war after all, did not make it appealing at all, and the speeches interspersed between the accounts of battles were interminable and almost worse than the battles. But his style of retelling the events of the war kept it interesting for me, in large part because it was reminiscent for me of learning ancient history in elementary school at home when my mom read to us from a child's history of the world. I understood the military maneuvers and strategies much better than I expected to, and I found myself well able to comment on the advantages and disadvantages of the various decisions the rulers and generals were making. My favorite part of the history was when the Athenians decided, against Pericles' express advice, to try and conquer Sicily, which failed miserably. It was an amazing year. I can't stress that enough. What an opportunity God has given me. End quote, and end of her blog post. Yes, this is all from a perspective of a 19-year-old girl finishing her first year in college. Our beautiful Maria has read many of the great books, even back during high school. Her very favorite author of all, Dante. She has always been a disciplined student and a serious young scholar, and Thomas Aquinas College was the only college she applied to. Now, let's turn back to Mortimer Adler and look at his most popular book. It's entitled How to Read a Book. This book was published in 1940 and is widely considered the definitive guidebook for people interested in improving their ability to read, comprehend, and debate what they read. Besides stressing that we should be reading the great books of our cultural heritage, Adler also speaks of the fact that people can improve the way they read. One blog I found entitled Right Attitudes says, this book stemmed from Adler's belief that students of liberal education need to be grounded in the great ideas of humankind as represented in the canon of the Western classic literature. For him, the art of reading well is deeply correlated to the art of thinking clearly and critically. If you're interested in this subject, I recommend that you go and get a hold of this book. You can find it in libraries. But be forewarned, it is a dense book. It seems that today, in this age of too much information, there's a big market for people to publish book summaries. So you may also look online for a summary of this book. You will find numerous results. I have even found at least 3 very fun animated YouTube videos that summarize the entire book. Actually, as I started writing this paper, I received an invitation to download a new app specialized in summaries. These young developers of Blinklist grew to 8 million customers in just a couple of years. Customers download summaries of all the major books published, all for $89 a year. So people want to read, they want to be informed, but they don't feel that they have the time for it. Also feel that they don't read well. How to read a book covers every aspect of reading we may be facing. The author lists everything from fairy tales to lyric poems, fiction, history, informational books. He's eloquent and very long-winded, so be ready to read some things you always thought were obvious and some passages that sound far too academic and some even pointless. The author gives general reading tips, such as trying to see books as a conversation with the author and keeping in mind that we read that books, and keeping in mind as we read that books are the, quote, imperfect creations of imperfect creatures. So he exhorts us to make books our own, highlight them, fold their pages, take notes, write on them, and even pay attention to the environment where you are reading. He identifies He identifies 4 levels of reading: elementary, inspectional, analytical, and the last one, a made-up word, he calls it the syntopical reading. The discussion of these 4 levels make up the bulk of the book. Here's a very quick summary of each of them. Elementary reading. When you master this level, you learn the rudiments of the art of reading, receive basic training in reading, and acquire good initial reading skills. The question that is asked at this level is, what does the book say? Second level is inspectional reading. It's also called pre-reading or even skimming. This level is about time. Its aim is to get the most out of a book given within a given time. This is usually done through an examination of the first surface of the book, checking things like the title of the book, the preface, table of contents, index, authors, publishers, blurbs, even reading a few pivotal pages. Finishing reading at this level, one should be able to answer the following questions. What kind of book is this? And what is this book about? His analytical reading is the most demanding of all the levels. It's more complex than the preceding levels and represents a complete form of reading. And I quote, "The analytical reader must ask many and organized questions to what he's reading. Analytical reading is always intensely active. On this level of reading, the reader grasps the book and the metaphor is apt and works at it until the book becomes his own," end quote. So in this level, the reader is asking, is this book true? Is it true in whole or in part? So the 4th level is what Adler calls syntopical reading or comparative reading. This is the most complex and systematical level. A syntopical reader reads different texts on the same subject and compares them to each other to arrive at a better understanding of the subject as a whole. Of course, today, with the internet, we can accomplish this rather more easily than taking the specific steps that he describes. The question posed is, what of it? At the end of this level is when the reading of this book may cause changes in us, the readers. Mortimer Adler wrote many other books. 2 of his more well-known titles are How to Think About the Great Ideas, From the Great Books of Western civilization. And another popular one was Aristotle for Everybody. He, like our friend Chesterton, is one of these highly quotable authors. So here are 3 gems by Mortimer Adler. Quote, "In the case of good books, the point is not to see how many of them you can get through, but rather how many can get through to you." The second one, quote, "Reading is a basic tool in living of a good life." And the third one, "A good book can teach you about the world and about yourself. You become wiser in the sense that you are more deeply aware of the great and enduring truths of human life." When Mortimer Adler died in 2001 at 98 years old, the New York Times published a beautiful obituary. The following is a small excerpt. Quote, "Dr. Adler spent much of his life combating the pragmatist philosophy of John Dewey, one of his teachers at Columbia University, and championing the notion propounded by Plato, Aristotle, and St. Thomas Aquinas that truth and values are absolute and they are unchanging. He wrote that fundamental ideas and concepts upon which education should be based are not merely the mores and beliefs which happen to be current in the 20th century. They are universal truth about what constitute a good education for all times and all places. To promote this goal, he helped devise the Great Books Program, a course of study in which classic Western literature, he fought his entire life for a return to a model of education that values our Western civilization, incredibly rich heritage." End quote. Today, we cannot read about the blossoming classical education in America or browse a website or catalog specialized in classical education without finding a reference to Mortimer Adler. Here is a very good place to insert what the New York Times obituary failed to mention, that at the end of his long life, having enjoyed most Catholic good friends who were like him, interested in a rebirth of classical education, Mortimer Adler, who grew up in a non-observant Jewish family, died a Catholic. Author Ralph McInerney is quoted saying, "Finally, he became the Roman Catholic he had been training to be all his life." I think it's interesting that perhaps much of what Mortimer Adler has done for us, for the readers of his books, for the students and professors involved in the Great Books movement, its wide ramifications, including the many conversions and vocations stemming from it, may have been all propelled by his disagreeing with one of his college teachers, Professor Dewey, who was himself heavily influenced by Karl Marx, and who is known for his theory and advocacy of progressive education that revolutionized the purpose of schooling in American life, according to Columbia University's website. So I wonder, what if Mortimer Adler hadn't had John Dewey as a professor at Columbia University? What if he didn't find something he passionately reacted against? And more, what if he didn't do anything about it? So this is another question that's posed for us tonight. How often in life are we called to turn around something difficult into a good? It is with the grace of God and his guidance that we can see the negative situations in our life resulting into very fruitful channels for the work of God's unbounded grace in this world. Let's close this section on Mortimer Adler with one last one of his quotes. Quote, "If a book is easy and fits nicely into all of our language conventions and thought forms, then we probably will not grow much from reading it. Raking is easy, but all we get is leaves. Digging is hard, but we may find diamonds." Finding diamonds through challenging ourselves into reading. That is so true. So we arrive now at the last part of this talk, probably the most fun for me. I will briefly discuss 6 authors who are for me examples of very good reading for Catholic readers, As much as I like and read quite a bit of nonfiction, I'm only bringing up here fiction examples because it is the well-written and captivating stories that make for the most unforgettable reading. First, Jane Austen. In 2007, a survey was done in the UK about favorite books, and wouldn't you know, Jane Austen, the old-fashioned societal portrait writer, won the day with Pride and Prejudice as #1, and 2 other of her titles on the top 10. I read the Jane Austen books back when they displayed their names in Portuguese in my parents' living room. Orgulho e Preconceito, Razão e Sentimento, and Persuasão. They're still the books I read most often, and I know I'm not quite alone in this periodical rereading of her novels just for the sheer delight of it. Now, if we think of how many novels have been written and published in the UK over the last few centuries, the obvious question surfaces: what holds Jane Austen supreme above all others? What in her writing keep readers entertained again and again during their lifetime? The question for us tonight here at Resurrection is also, as we explore the ins and outs of what comprises a good book, why is it universally acknowledged that Pride and Prejudice is a good book? One we tell our children to read, one we quote often, one we give to friends as gifts, one we always have newly published editions every time we get into the bookstore. Pride and Prejudice, of course, isn't a Catholic book on the surface, but it doesn't take long as we dive into it to discover the Catholic themes. The first one comes to mind immediately from the title. We're dealing here with our own faults, the ones portrayed by our dear protagonists so well. The faults that, if undiscovered and unrepented, will inexorably keep the 2 main characters apart forever. My take is that everything in that book is background for Lizzie and Darcy to undergo their humbling self-examination and admission of their faults, their pride, and their prejudice. The Bennets, the girls flirting with the officers, Charlotte's marriage to Mr. Collins, Rose's Park, the accidental visit to Pemberley. In this multicolored background, Lizzie and Darcy embody for us our own sinfulness. But much more importantly than that, they embody for us our own sorrow over our faults, our admission of sin, and our lack of peace that results from them. Which one of us could not relate to these elements? Aren't they universal, or Catholic for that matter? What comes for Lizzie and Darcy after humble recognition of their own errors? Fulfillment. So we read again and again this beautifully written, funny, intelligent, and delightful story, and find in it our own story of sin and sorrow and redemption. A great book does that. Second, I delighted in reading the Laura Ingalls books in Portuguese as a little girl. From them, I learned about obedience, courage, kindness, and other universal lessons that transcend distance and transcend geography. I could so much identify with Laura, as I, too, was the rambunctious one of 2 dear sisters, and so I wished I could be as good as my sister. Ma was the calming, balanced, and loving guide for little Laura, as my mother was to me. But down in Brazil, the geography of the endless prairie and the harshness of its brutal winters was not something I could fathom. Little did I know, when I found the Laura Ingalls little town on the prairie on my father's huge National Geographic wall map, that one day I would live through those long winters for 13 years in South Dakota. In South Dakota, listening to the audio narration of the Little House books, then in its original English, then with my own little girls driving across the same South Dakota windswept landscape to and from the acreage we lived in, and under the same skies and formations of migrating birds. Those were literary come-to-life days for me. Laura, of course, wasn't Catholic. And I brought this up to my mom one day. I was very concerned after finishing a chapter where Laura was definitely unhappy with the preacher's sermon. In her infinite wisdom, my good mother looked at me and told me as in confidence, I quote, Laura was so smart. Had she come across some good Catholic people, had she been able to read the catechism, she would have certainly converted. So I live every day in the hope that if God willing, I ever make it to heaven, there will sit Laura Ingalls, maybe resting on a prairie wind-blown cloud and fully Catholic. Third, a Princeton graduate and co-founder of Christendom College, Jeff Myris, says in a wonderful article that Sigrid Undset is considered by some as the world's best novelist. She received the 1928 Nobel Prize for Literature after writing the remarkable historical saga entitled Kristin Lavransdatter. In this monumental trilogy, we follow the story of the strong-headed Kristin from her childhood to the end of her life. The book is set in Undset's native Norway in medieval times. The novel masterfully recreates a world where the Catholic faith and customs were still dealing with residual local pagan practices. Kristin is passionate and very sinful in her youth, and we see in her plight our own personal story of sin, regret, penance, and forgiveness. The book is a page-turner, and in some circles it has earned much fame for driving mothers to neglect all housework for many days. It happened to me too. I seem to reread Kristin Lavransdatter every decade to find in those pages new, marvelous insights. I listened to it very recently, and I discovered in the olden Kristin subtle facets I had never noticed before. A good book does that. The symbolism of the wreaths in the novel, for example, the bridal wreath she shames and the red rose wreath she chooses, these seem to bring at every reading a more powerful, if faithful, image. That novel is semi-autobiographical. Sigrid Undset herself suffered deeply in life, in many levels, through personal sin and its consequences, with the Second World War, through exile, and through the death of her children. Like her protagonist, she chose to live a monastic life at the end of her life. For us Catholics, what's most exciting about this author is a discovery of her Catholic faith while working on the research for this book. I found Kristin's faith throughout her adventurous life in the book to be exhilarating. At every step of her sorrowful life journey, her dialogues with God and her unwavering faith are the high points for me. They came from the sincere heart and the pen of the author. Sigrid Undset wrote several other Catholic books, including the 4-volume Master of Hestviken, but it is Kristin Lavransdatter that brings her newfound faith to the page in the best developed literary tension. Later in life, she wrote about saints, and her biography of Saint Catherine of Siena is greatly admired and worth reading. Fourth, since I have only mentioned women writers so far, I want to touch on the prolific Charles Dickens. At home, we laugh at how none of us really like him very much, but we seem to be magically attracted to his fiction. So just for fun, after reading and disliking Hard Times and its heavy-handed preachy message for book club, I went on to reread David Copperfield, A Tale of Two Cities, and finally, his last work, New to Me, Our Mutual Friend. All Dickens' works bring us sorrow and beautiful moral passages, all populated by seemingly impossible coincidences. Some are more interesting than others, all a bit flat, in my opinion, but I think he redeems himself to a certain extent in this last one. In Our Mutual Friend, we have two couples of protagonists, and we see goodness and love at work. In each of the couples, there is one character who must undergo, like Darcy and Lizzie Bennet, a self-examination and a change. Dickens' characters are more cartoonish than Jane Austen's, but they really still provide a satisfying read. The fifth one, I'm a contributor and writer for the National Well-Read Mom Book Club for Catholic Women, And I will read a couple passages from my Willa Cather book reflection in the 2015 Book Club Companion and Study Guide. Quote, I have loved the writing of Willa Cather since our family lived in Nebraska. During those years, my husband and I read quite a bit of her work and were enchanted especially by her two Catholic books, the marvelous and unique Death Comes to the Archbishop, and the one set in Canada entitled Shadows on the Rock. I have often wondered how Cather came to be so knowledgeable of things Catholic, history, hierarchy, sacramental life. For years, I had liked to believe that Sigrid Undset had influenced Willa Cather. The Norwegian author had met Cather while in self-exile in New York City during World War II. The two writers became dear friends. What would be more obvious? But I was wrong in my supposition. Death Comes for the Archbishop was written prior to their meeting. So I dug deeply online, and lo and behold, I found a paper by a professor at SDSU entitled Willa Cather's French Neighbors. So the mystery was solved. The author grew up in a small town in Nebraska populated by French Canadians, all Catholic. The stories and characters in her Catholic books were taken from real people. She had visited their homes and enjoyed daily life among their families and learned of stories that she never forgot. Later in life, when Willa spent time both in New Mexico and in Canada, she remembered those stories and she transformed them into wonderful books. One of the best literary things I have done was to read Death Comes for the Archbishop before visiting Santa Fe, New Mexico for the first time. A statue of the protagonist sits imposing on the front of the Frary Cathedral he built in Santa Fe. I discussed shadows with a dear friend, and in our conversation, he reminded me of the behind-the-scenes role that Cecile, the protagonist, plays, a role that women have played in history from time immemorial, a role essential for humanity and for civilization. Cecile not only makes a home in every sense for their little family, caring for the little things that kept culture and civilization alive, but also from this home, she causes love to radiate outward. The stability and bounty of their home spreads out to shelter and feed the poor old man, the little wayward boy, and all who come to visit them. Her home is a tangible model of what the family is called to be by God, a cell of our society, spreading love and light. Finally, we cannot close a discussion of Catholic authors without briefly bringing up Flannery O'Connor. Her tales are portrayals of a grotesque world, but a world where she also found the light of grace pouring suddenly on the most unlikely subjects. O'Connor was a fervent Catholic and made no qualms about it. Her quotes can be pretty funny. She's considered by many as the best American writer of all time, and she is beloved by Catholic and non-Catholic alike. So I close this section on books on good fiction authors with 3 gems from her, just 3 short quotes. First one, the truth does not change according to our ability to stomach it. The second one, grace changes us and change is painful. And the third one, what people don't realize is how much religion costs. They think faith is a big blanket, when of course it is the cross. So to bring this whole and long talk to a close, I want to bring us back to the dinner table at home. I am the 7th of a family of 10 children, and many were the books discussed at our family dinner table. My youngest sister is a Benedictine religious, and in her abbey, they have the tradition of listening to good books that are read aloud during the mealtime. We think is also key in a child's education. For many, many years, I read aloud to the kids during school hours, and Jeff read aloud to the kids after dinner, always targeting the reading level to the older kids. The kids stopped everything for this family reading time when Daddy was at home. Today, our kids have very fond memories of those years, and they love chatting about it. The younger kids were encouraged to have pencil and paper or something quiet to work on, and they listened to C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, Jules Verne. From recorded books during our car trips, we all enjoyed listening to the Sherlock Holmes stories, to Mark Twain, to James Herriot, and to myriad other good children's books. We even listened to classical history books for children, as our daughter mentions on her blog. Many of them kept the habit of listening and reading good books. The discussions at meals and listening together times, those times bring us the very best family memories. Good books. We believe that second only to teaching them our Catholic faith, there is no better tool for the education of children than good books. Thank you so much for your attention. And if I don't know, I'll just say I don't know. Go ahead.
What's the name of the history book that you're involved with that's used in school?
The one that we use here at Resurrection is called, the collection is called the Catholic History Project. Catholic Textbook History Project. And each volume, there are several volumes, have different names. So Mr. Fink would be the one to say exactly which one he's using right now and with which class. Thank you. Yes?
You mentioned were you instrumental with the Great Books program, or you went to the college with the Great Books program?
My husband is a graduate of St. John's, who is the original Great Books program. So many of our friends in our circle of friends are graduates from there.
Are you familiar, when I was in school in Detroit, we did the junior Great Books in grade school. I think it started like fourth grade or something.
There are, and I was going to mention that there are many lists online. There are the good books, the 1,000 great books, the 5,000 great books, the junior good books, different.
Actually, they were a set.
Right. There have been collections published. So those are easy to find. They differ somehow, somewhat. Different curricula or different publishers will have different ones. But I think I have come across the junior great books or good books, whatever they were called. So thank you. Yeah. Yes? Thanks for asking that. I know that has been a question brought up at St. John's College. Of course, their foundation is based on the canon of books from Western civilization. But I believe that they have introduced, correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff, a few of the Eastern books now. And if you go maybe online to their website, that answer would... A different program in the college is offering the Eastern classics. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay, thanks. Yes?
Why are there not more young people here?
That's a good question, because I knew wine was served, so we were going to bring our daughter, who is not 21, and she thought she might be the only one here, so she didn't come. So maybe that could go on the website. That's right. Yeah. Thank you. Yes?
I'm just wondering if you enjoyed the wine and the cheese at that dinner. That was so disappointing for the conversation.
I probably did.
I think they may have had too much.
Maybe. Maybe you're right. That was a long time ago, Father.
Lumen Veritatis. Maybe you're not so smart or talking.
Thank you very much. Oh, one more. Go ahead.
Is there a way, again,
I'm very happy you asked this question. As a mother of 7 children and very concerned about what my kids read. I actually have a way I do that. If you're not at the library or at the bookstore, you're usually at home, right? I go on Amazon and I look at the reviews. And more than a few times, I looked at the top negative reviews and the top positive reviews. And sometimes they tell me exactly what I'm looking for. If a children's book, let's say a middle school book, has a lot of junk in it and graphic stuff, someone will have written a negative review saying, this book has this, this, and that. Passages are quoted. So it's not a foolproof method, but it's a very good one. And I am one of those that if I see something wrong with a book, I will get on Amazon and I will make sure that other people that are looking for it can read it. So it's a very helpful tool. Like I said, not foolproof, but helpful. So try that. Yes?
Okay, here's my challenge, having read a reasonable amount of classic literature, and even as you described Adler's book, long passages of pointlessness, and then drives people to say, I'm done with this book, I'm not even going to finish. And so much of classic literature, I'm afraid, even for young people that aren't here, they won't be able to get past when they start hitting those things. But how do and even as you mentioned, Homer, the Greek literature, it's really hard, especially for young people today, to realize there's virtue in slogging through this.
And this is completely personal, but I think there's probably a reason why classical education and great books went down for a long time. We kind of lost them. So these professors coming up with let's resurrect this type of education was a very big effort because people had said, who cares? This is too much work, but there is an interest, and I think a college program and some high school programs are like that too, especially in the homeschool. They challenge the kids, and lo and behold, some kids, they actually rise to the occasion and they love it. But maybe if it wasn't part of their homework, they wouldn't read all of Homer or the book of Ezekiel. So they need that structure. But it takes us, and also perhaps the kids who are educated to read better, to appreciate this type of education better, will be the ones more likely to enjoy that and finish the books. Yes?
Isn't a focus on Western civilization considered politically incorrect?
Probably. Probably, yes, yes.
So are you going to help Resurrection come up with a reading list that is classical for these kids at this school?
I could ask my boss about that.
My daughter's in 8th grade, and she has Down syndrome, so I have to read things with her and so on, and I don't like some of the selections, and I think, my gosh, there are so many great things.
Books.
Please, why this stuff?
And my husband and I have been in principal's offices in different states, different schools, public and Catholic, having that same discussion with books that I don't think are read here at all, books that nobody should read. So we have an experience with that. I have always told Jacob I'm happy to help with whatever, but I don't think that's in my job description. Yes?
When I was in school, we had just exciting teachers who knew a lot about the books. So when I was a freshman in high school, we were reading the great books that they read in college because our teachers were educated about them. And sometimes I think a lot of our newer teachers don't know about some of these things, so they don't teach them.
Goes back to education, right? So, this resurrection of a more classical approach of education in all of the United States, I think, is a wonderful sign of hope. I have a son who's now applying. His degree is in classical philology, and he's applying for jobs in different classical academies, and he's like, Mom, they're all over the place. They're brand new, or they're 2 years old. So there is a thirst for what is good. But I think a lot of things will have to come up from the ground again. Reading the kids' Aesop fables. I have students who never read them, so I actually take time in Latin class to read it to them and teach them the names of the animals in Latin. So these things are important. And I think a lot of us are doing some good things that way. So with God's help, yes. Okay, here's Brian, so we're done.